Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in rural Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn storm of 1934 arrived without warning across Harlan County, Kentucky. For 3 days, rain fell with the persistence of something trying to wash away sins that had been buried too deep. The Lunsford property, situated 12 miles southwest of the county seat, had weathered many storms before. The farmhouse, built in 1891 by patriarch Thomas Lunsford, stood on a gentle rise overlooking tobacco fields that stretched toward the Cumberland Mountains. But this storm was different. This storm had purpose. When the waters receded on October 23, 1934, they left behind more than just mud and debris. They left behind questions that would haunt the Lunsford name for generations. The basement of the old farmhouse, which had served as root storage for over 40 years, now revealed an architectural impossibility. Where the eastern wall had always stood solid, the floodwaters had loosened mortar and stones, revealing a space that shouldn't exist, a room that measured approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, with no apparent entrance from the main basement. A room that the current residents, Harold and Margaret Lunsford, claimed to know nothing about. The discovery was made by Harold himself on the morning of October 24th. According to the account he gave to County Sheriff James Morrison 3 weeks later, he had descended into the basement to assess flood damage when he noticed irregular spacing in the eastern foundation wall. A section of stones had shifted, creating a gap large enough for a man to squeeze through. What he found on the other side defied explanation. The hidden chamber contained items that suggested prolonged occupancy. A metal bed frame, rusted but intact. A small wooden table with deep gouges carved into its surface. Most disturbing were the scratches along the walls, hundreds of them, organized in groups of 5, as if someone had been marking time. The room had no windows, no ventilation, save for a narrow gap near the ceiling that connected to the main basement. The air, Harold reported, carried a smell he couldn't identify but would never forget. To understand the significance of this discovery, one must first understand the Lunsford family themselves. Harold Lunsford had inherited the property from his father Thomas, who died of consumption in 1928. The inheritance had not been without complications. Thomas Lunsford had been a solitary man, widowed when his wife Sarah disappeared mysteriously in 1893. Harold, who had been working tobacco farms in neighboring counties during his 20s, returned home only after receiving word of his father's declining health. Neighbors described Thomas as a man changed by loss. Where he had once been involved in community affairs, he became reclusive, often going months without being seen in town. The hired workers who tended the farm reported strange noises from the house at night, particularly from the basement area. These reports were generally dismissed as the sounds of an old house settling, or perhaps Thomas working late on farm equipment repairs. No one thought to question further. Harold Lunsford married Margaret Flynn in 1929, a union that brought some stability to the property. Margaret, daughter of a shopkeeper from nearby Cumberland, was described by contemporaries as practical and level-headed. She took charge of restoring the neglected farmhouse to habitability, supervising repairs and renovations that had been deferred during Thomas's final years of life. It was Margaret who insisted on having the basement properly cleaned and organized for food storage, though she would later state that she always felt uncomfortable in that space. The couple lived quietly on the farm for 5 years before the storm changed everything. Harold worked the tobacco fields with the help of seasonal laborers, while Margaret tended a kitchen garden and maintained the household. They attended services at Harlan Methodist Church sporadically, but were not considered particularly social by their neighbors. The nearest residents belonged to the Whitaker family, whose farm lay nearly 2 miles to the north. Contact between the properties was minimal, limited to occasional shared labor during harvest time. When the storm struck on October 20th, 1934, it brought with it winds that toppled century-old oaks and rain that turned creeks into torrents. The Lunsford property, situated in a valley that typically provided protection from severe weather, found itself in the path of runoff from higher elevations. Water entered the basement through foundation cracks that had gone unnoticed for years, creating a flood that reached nearly 4 feet in depth at its peak. Harold and Margaret spent those 3 days huddled in the upper floor of the farmhouse, listening to the storm tear at the roof and watching water rise in their yard until it lapped at the front porch. They had no telephone, no radio, and no means of communication with the outside world. When morning finally broke on October 23rd, the silence was more unsettling than the storm had been. The cleanup began immediately. Harold waded into the basement wearing his father's old boots, carrying an oil lamp to survey the damage. The water had receded, leaving behind a coating of mud and debris that covered everything. Preserved food stored in jars had been knocked from their shelves and broken. Farm tools had been shifted and scattered. But it was while clearing mud from the eastern wall that Harold noticed the stones had moved. He would later describe the moment to Sheriff Morrison with remarkable precision, as if the memory had been etched into his consciousness with unnatural clarity. The stone that had always marked the corner of that wall was now positioned 3 inches to the left of where it should be. The mortar between stones had cracked in a pattern that suggested intentional weakening rather than natural deterioration. When Harold pressed against the shifted section, it moved with surprising ease, revealing darkness beyond. The gap was narrow, perhaps 18 inches at its widest point. Harold squeezed through with his lamp held ahead of him, expecting to find a small void created by foundation settling. Instead, he found himself standing in a finished room with smooth stone walls and a packed earth floor. The lamplight revealed the bed frame first, its metal rails bent and twisted in places, as if great force had been applied to them over time. The table sat beside it, its wooden surface scarred with what appeared to be deliberate markings. But it was the walls that held Harold's attention longest. The scratches covered every available surface within reach of someone lying on the bed or sitting at the table. They were organized methodically, grouped in clusters of 5 marks each, with longer scratches separating what appeared to be larger groupings. Harold counted over 2,000 individual marks before the oil in his lamp ran low and he was forced to return to the main basement. Margaret's reaction to her husband's discovery was immediate and absolute. The opening should be sealed immediately and never discussed. She refused to enter the hidden room herself, stating that she could sense wrongness about it even from the main basement. Her insistence on secrecy was so vehement that Harold agreed without argument, though he would later admit to Sheriff Morrison that he had returned to the room several times in the weeks that followed, trying to make sense of what he had found. The couple's attempt to seal the opening and forget what lay behind it might have succeeded were it not for a chance encounter with their neighbor, Edgar Whitaker. 3 weeks after the storm, Whitaker stopped by the Lunsford property to offer assistance with flood cleanup. During the visit, Harold mentioned in passing that they had discovered some structural damage in the basement, including a gap in the foundation that needed repair. Whitaker, a man with some experience in construction work, offered to help examine the damage. Despite Margaret's obvious discomfort, she could not refuse the neighborly gesture without appearing odd. The 3 descended into the basement together, where Whitaker immediately noticed that the gap Harold had described was clearly artificial. The stones had been deliberately loosened, not damaged by floodwater. When Whitaker squeezed through the opening to investigate, his reaction was one of immediate alarm. Edgar Whitaker had served overseas during the Great War and had seen things that most men of his generation preferred not to discuss. But what he found in that hidden room reminded him of places he had hoped never to think about again. The scratches on the walls, he told Sheriff Morrison later, reminded him of similar markings he had seen in cellars, used as makeshift prisons during the war. The bed frame showed signs of having restraints attached to it at some point. Most disturbing was a smell that seemed to emanate from the earth floor itself, a smell that Whitaker described as something that had been rotting for years. It was Whitaker who insisted on involving the authorities. Despite Harold and Margaret's protests that the room was simply an old storage space they had forgotten about, Whitaker contacted Sheriff Morrison and requested an official investigation. Morrison, a thorough man who had held his position for 12 years, agreed to examine the site personally. Sheriff Morrison's initial report, filed November 15, 1934, described the hidden room in clinical detail. He noted the systematic nature of the wall markings, the modified bed frame, and what he termed evidence of long-term occupancy by an unwilling resident. Most significant was his discovery of fabric remnants buried in the earth floor, fabric that appeared to be from women's clothing dating to the 1890s. The investigation that followed was hampered by several factors. Harold Lunsford maintained that he had no knowledge of the room's existence prior to the flood, and that his father had never mentioned any such space during Harold's adult visits to the property. Margaret corroborated her husband's account and refused to speculate about the room's purpose. Most critically, Thomas Lunsford, the most likely source of answers, had been dead for 6 years. However, Morrison's inquiry did uncover some disturbing information about the late Thomas Lunsford. Several longtime residents of Harlan County recalled that Thomas's wife, Sarah, had not died in childbirth as commonly believed. According to these accounts, Sarah Lunsford had simply disappeared one day in the autumn of 1893, leaving behind questions that were never satisfactorily answered. Thomas had claimed she died of complications, but no death certificate had ever been filed with the county. No burial had taken place in any local cemetery. The fabric found in the hidden room was examined by Dr. William Hayes, the county physician, who determined that it appeared to be from a woman's dress consistent with styles worn in the 1890s. More disturbing, the fabric showed what Dr. Hayes described as deterioration patterns consistent with extended burial in damp earth. Chemical analysis, primitive by later standards but adequate for the time, suggested the presence of human remains had once been in contact with the fabric. As news of the discovery spread through Harlan County, other details about Thomas Lunsford began to emerge. Several women recalled that Sarah Lunsford had confided fears about her husband's increasing possessiveness during the months before her disappearance. She had mentioned to at least 2 neighbors that Thomas had become obsessively concerned about her leaving the property, even to visit family or conduct necessary business in town. These conversations had taken place in the weeks before her disappearance. Most damaging to Thomas's posthumous reputation was testimony from James Fletcher, who had worked as hired labor on the Lunsford farm from 1892 to 1895. Fletcher, now 73, and living with relatives in Cumberland, told Sheriff Morrison that he had frequently heard sounds from the basement area of the farmhouse during his time working for Thomas. When Fletcher had asked about the noises, Thomas had claimed to be working on farm equipment repairs that required privacy. Fletcher also recalled that Thomas had insisted on doing all basement work alone, even tasks that typically required 2 men. On multiple occasions, Fletcher had offered to help move heavy items or assist with repairs, only to be told that his help was not needed. Most significant was Fletcher's recollection of a conversation in which Thomas had mentioned making improvements to ensure that what belonged on the farm stayed on the farm. The investigation reached its conclusion in January of 1935, when Sheriff Morrison filed his final report. The document, which remained sealed until 1952, concluded that circumstantial evidence strongly suggested that Sarah Lunsford had been imprisoned in the hidden room against her will and had likely died there. The systematic wall markings indicated a period of captivity lasting months or possibly years. The modified bed frame and lack of proper ventilation suggested conditions designed to prevent escape rather than ensure comfort. However, with Thomas Lunsford dead and no witness to the actual events of 1893, no charges could be filed. The case was officially closed with a finding of probable unlawful death, but without sufficient evidence for criminal prosecution. The hidden room was sealed under court order, and Harold Lunsford was instructed to never disturb the space again. The impact on Harold and Margaret Lunsford was immediate and lasting. Within 6 months of the investigation's conclusion, they had sold the farm to a Cumberland businessman and moved to Cincinnati, where Harold found work in a manufacturing plant. Margaret would later tell relatives that she could never feel safe in the house after learning what it had concealed. She reported persistent nightmares about sounds from the basement, even after the room had been sealed. The farmhouse sat empty for nearly 10 years after the Lunsfords departed. Local residents avoided the property, and its reputation for harboring dark secrets made it impossible to sell at any reasonable price. During this period, several break-ins occurred, with vandals apparently attempting to access the sealed basement room. Each intrusion was reported to authorities, but no arrests were ever made. In 1944, the property was purchased by Robert Chen, an immigrant who had moved to Kentucky to work in the coal industry. Chen, apparently unaware of the property's history, bought the farm at a significantly reduced price and moved his family into the renovated farmhouse. The Chen family lived there peacefully for 3 years, during which time no unusual incidents were reported. The calm ended in 1947, when Chen decided to modernize the basement for use as a workshop. While installing new electrical wiring, he discovered that the sealed room's entrance had been partially reopened. Whether this was the result of foundation settling or deliberate human action was never determined, but Chen found the gap wide enough to allow entry to the hidden chamber. Against the advice of neighbors who were aware of the room's history, Chen decided to investigate the space thoroughly. What he found there changed his perspective on his property permanently. In addition to the original evidence documented by Sheriff Morrison 13 years earlier, Chen discovered items that had apparently been placed in the room more recently. These included several personal effects that had belonged to his predecessor, Harold Lunsford. Most disturbing was Chen's discovery of a journal hidden beneath loose stones in the room's floor. The journal, written in Harold Lunsford's distinctive handwriting, contained entries dating from 1929 through 1934. The contents suggested that Harold had known about the hidden room long before the flood that supposedly revealed it. According to the journal entries, Harold had discovered the space while conducting repairs in 1929, shortly after his marriage to Margaret. The journal revealed that Harold had initially been horrified by his discovery, particularly when he found what he believed to be human remains buried in the room's floor. However, rather than reporting the finding to authorities, he had chosen to conceal it to protect his father's memory and his own inheritance. The journal documented Harold's gradual mental deterioration as he struggled with knowledge of what his father had done. Most chilling were entries describing Harold's growing obsession with the hidden room and his increasing identification with his father's mindset. By 1933, according to the journal, Harold had begun spending time in the room, reflecting on what it must have been like for the person who had been imprisoned there. He wrote extensively about his resentment toward Margaret for her independence and her tendency to visit friends and family without seeking his permission. The final entries, written just days before the 1934 storm, suggested that Harold had been contemplating using the room for its original purpose. He wrote about modifications he planned to make to ensure complete isolation and security. The storm's damage to the basement wall had apparently disrupted these plans by making the room's existence impossible to conceal. Robert Chen immediately contacted authorities upon discovering the journal. A new investigation was opened in 1948, led by Sheriff Morrison's successor, Deputy Carl Watson, who had recently been elected to the position. Watson's investigation confirmed the authenticity of the journal through handwriting analysis and corroborated many of its claims through examination of physical evidence in the hidden room. The renewed investigation also uncovered additional information about the Lunsford family history. Church records from the 1890s revealed that Sarah Lunsford had approached the Methodist minister, Reverend Charles Whitman, in September of 1893, seeking advice about what she described as unnatural restrictions being placed on her movements by her husband. Whitman's private notes, discovered in church archives, indicated that Sarah had been planning to leave Thomas and seek shelter with relatives in Virginia. These plans had apparently never been realized. The last verified sighting of Sarah Lunsford was on October 3, 1893, when she was seen in the company of her husband at Patterson's General Store in Harlan. Store clerk Benjamin Patterson recalled the visit because Thomas had done all the talking while Sarah had remained silent and appeared distressed. Patterson noted that Thomas had purchased an unusual quantity of rope and metal hardware during that visit. The 1948 investigation also attempted to locate Harold and Margaret Lunsford, who had not been seen in Harlan County since their departure 13 years earlier. Cincinnati police records showed that Harold Lunsford had been employed at Procter & Gamble from 1935 to 1941, but had left that position under circumstances that personnel managers described as unsatisfactory performance related to behavioral concerns. Margaret Lunsford had filed for divorce in 1942, citing irreconcilable differences. Court records indicated that she had requested and received a restraining order against Harold, though the specific reasons were sealed. Margaret had subsequently returned to her maiden name and moved to an undisclosed location. Efforts to locate her for questioning were unsuccessful. Harold Lunsford's whereabouts after 1942 remained unknown until 1951, when his death certificate was filed in Louisville. The certificate indicated that he had died of pneumonia while residing in a boarding house under an assumed name. The landlord who reported his death stated that Harold had lived alone and had rarely spoken to other residents. His personal effects included multiple notebooks filled with detailed floor plans and architectural drawings of basements and underground rooms. The final resolution of the Lunsford case came in 1952, when Harlan County authorities decided to permanently seal the hidden room and declare the property condemned for residential use. The decision followed recommendations from Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a psychiatrist from the University of Kentucky who had studied the mental health effects of the case on successive property owners. Dr. Sinclair's report, filed in March of 1952, documented a pattern of negative psychological effects among individuals who had extended contact with the hidden room. Robert Chen had experienced persistent nightmares and anxious thoughts after discovering Harold's journal, symptoms that had improved only after he moved his family away from the property. Chen's wife and 2 adult sons reported similar effects, including feelings of being watched and difficulty sleeping when in the farmhouse basement. Most significantly, Dr. Sinclair's investigation revealed that at least 3 individuals who had broken into the property during its years of abandonment had subsequently exhibited behavioral changes consistent with obsessive thoughts. One of these individuals, a local resident named Frank Morrison, had been found by family members constructing a replica of the hidden room in his own basement. Morrison claimed that the room fascinated him and that he understood its purpose better than anyone who had previously studied it. The pattern was sufficiently disturbing that county authorities voted to have the hidden room filled with concrete and the basement entrance permanently sealed. The farmhouse itself was demolished in 1953, and the land was converted to county use as a watershed protection area. A marker was placed on the site, but it made no reference to the property's history, identifying it only as the Lunsford Memorial Conservation Area. However, the story of the hidden room did not end with the property's demolition. In 1958, construction workers building a new county road discovered a second underground chamber on adjacent land that had once been part of the original Lunsford farm. This chamber, located approximately 100 yards from the farmhouse site, contained similar scratched wall markings and evidence of prolonged occupancy. The discovery suggested that Thomas Lunsford's activities had been more extensive than initially believed. Archaeological examination of the second chamber revealed personal effects belonging to at least 2 additional women, based on clothing fragments and jewelry that could be dated to the 1880s and early 1890s. County records showed that 2 local women had disappeared during that period under circumstances that had never been satisfactorily explained. News of the second chamber's discovery prompted a broader investigation of missing persons cases in Harlan County dating back to 1875, when Thomas Lunsford had first settled in the area as a young man. The review identified 7 women who had disappeared without trace over an 18-year period, all of them single or widowed, all of them known to have had some contact with Thomas Lunsford in the weeks before their disappearances. The investigation of Thomas Lunsford's activities was completed in 1960, but the findings were not made public until 1968, when a graduate student at Eastern Kentucky University named David Richardson gained access to the sealed case files for his doctoral dissertation on rural crime patterns. Richardson's research, published as Hidden Chambers, a Study of Serial Crime in Rural Kentucky, provided the first comprehensive analysis of the evidence against Thomas Lunsford. Richardson's work established that Thomas Lunsford had likely been responsible for the deaths of at least 5 women over a 20-year period, using the hidden chambers to imprison his victims before killing them. The systematic wall markings found in both chambers were consistent with captivity periods ranging from several months to over a year. The evidence suggested that Sarah Lunsford, his wife, had been his final victim, killed when she discovered his activities and threatened to expose him. Most disturbing was Richardson's analysis of the social dynamics that had allowed Thomas to continue his activities for so long. The remote location of his farm, combined with his reputation as a grieving widower after Sarah's disappearance, had provided perfect cover for his crimes. The victims he had chosen were all women whose disappearances could be explained as voluntary departures from an area where economic opportunities were limited and social support systems were weak. Richardson's dissertation also explored the psychological effects that had passed from Thomas to his son Harold. The evidence suggested that Harold had not merely discovered his father's crimes and attempted to conceal them, but had been influenced by exposure to an environment where women were viewed as possessions to be controlled rather than individuals with independent rights. Harold's journal entries revealed a gradual adoption of similar attitudes, culminating in his own plans to use the family's hidden chambers. The publication of Richardson's research in 1968 brought renewed attention to the Lunsford case and prompted several other researchers to investigate similar patterns in rural crime. However, the physical evidence was no longer available for study, as the concrete-filled chambers had been declared permanently inaccessible for safety reasons. The land itself remained under county control, with access restricted to authorized personnel only. In the decades since the case's resolution, the Lunsford story has become part of local folklore in Harlan County, though the details are often distorted in retelling. Some versions of the story claim that Thomas Lunsford was involved in practices beyond simple imprisonment and murder. Others suggest that the mental health effects experienced by later property owners were evidence of supernatural influences rather than trauma related to knowledge of the crimes. These embellished versions of the story have overshadowed the documented facts of the case and have contributed to a mythology that obscures the real horror of what occurred on the Lunsford property. The actual crimes committed by Thomas and potentially by his son Harold represent a pattern of domestic terrorism that was enabled by social isolation and a cultural framework that treated women as property rather than individuals. The Lunsford case remains relevant today as an example of how family secrets can perpetuate cycles of violence across generations. Harold Lunsford's journal entries document his struggle with knowledge of his father's crimes and his gradual adoption of similar attitudes toward the women in his own life. The fact that he came close to repeating his father's crimes suggests that exposure to extreme domestic violence can create behavioral patterns that persist even when the original perpetrator is no longer alive. Perhaps most significantly, the case illustrates how communities can unknowingly enable criminal behavior by accepting social isolation as normal and by failing to investigate disappearances thoroughly when the victims are members of marginalized groups. The 7 women who disappeared over the course of Thomas Lunsford's criminal career were all individuals whose absence from the community was noted but not thoroughly investigated, largely because their social positions made them easy to dismiss as voluntary departures. The Lunsford property today bears no visible trace of its dark history. The land remains under county protection, officially designated as Watershed Preservation Area, but actually maintained to prevent any future disturbance of the sealed underground chambers. Occasional visitors to the area report feelings of unease when walking the former farmhouse site, though researchers familiar with the case attribute these reactions to knowledge of the location's history rather than any supernatural causes. In 1967, nearly 33 years after the original discovery that had begun the investigation, Margaret Lunsford contacted Harlan County authorities to provide additional information about her former husband's behavior during their final years together. Margaret, then 71 years old and living in Oregon under her remarried name, had maintained silence about Harold's activities since their divorce 25 years earlier. According to Margaret's statement given to investigators during a trip to Louisville, Harold had become increasingly controlling and paranoid during their final years on the Lunsford property. She revealed that he had installed locks on interior doors of the farmhouse and had insisted that she account for every moment she spent away from the property. Most disturbing was her revelation that Harold had taken her to visit the hidden room on multiple occasions, forcing her to examine the evidence of his father's crimes while describing what he called the family legacy. Margaret's testimony provided final confirmation that Harold Lunsford had been planning to continue his father's pattern of imprisonment and murder. According to her account, Harold had spoken explicitly about maintaining family traditions and had suggested that Margaret's independence represented a betrayal of her role as his wife. She had fled the marriage when Harold began making modifications to the hidden room that would have made it suitable for prolonged occupancy. Margaret's decision to finally speak about her experiences was prompted by news coverage of Richardson's dissertation and her realization that other researchers were attempting to understand the social dynamics that had enabled the Lunsford crimes. Her testimony provided crucial insight into the process by which knowledge of extreme family violence can influence successive generations, even when the original perpetrator is not present to directly influence his successors. The interview with Margaret Lunsford was conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen, daughter of Robert Chen, who had discovered Harold's journal 20 years earlier. Dr. Chen, a forensic psychiatrist, was researching inherited trauma patterns for a book she was writing about family violence in rural communities. Her work would later contribute to understanding how environmental factors can trigger behavioral changes in people predisposed to criminal thinking. Dr. Chen's research, published in 1971 as Chambers of Memory, Inherited Violence in American Families, used the Lunsford case as a primary example of how physical environments can serve as triggers for criminal behavior. She argued that Harold Lunsford's exposure to his father's hidden chamber had gradually normalized extreme controlling behavior and had provided him with a template for acting on violent impulses toward women. The book also explored the broader social factors that had enabled both Thomas and Harold Lunsford to develop their criminal plans without detection. Dr. Chen identified rural isolation, economic dependency of women, and cultural acceptance of male dominance as key elements that had allowed the Lunsford men to view imprisonment and murder as acceptable responses to female independence. Most controversially, Dr. Chen's work suggested that the mental health effects experienced by later visitors to the Lunsford property were not simply trauma responses, but represented a form of environmental influence that could trigger similar violent thoughts in susceptible individuals. Her theory that physical spaces could retain psychological imprints of extreme violence was widely debated in academic circles, but gained support from researchers studying the long-term effects of trauma on families and communities. The debate over Dr. Chen's theories was resolved in part by events that occurred in 1973, when county authorities decided to conduct a final excavation of the Lunsford property before permanently converting it to wilderness area. The excavation, led by archaeologist Dr. Michael Torres from the University of Louisville, was intended to recover any remaining physical evidence and to document the site thoroughly for historical preservation. Dr. Torres's team discovered 2 additional underground chambers that had not been found during previous investigations. These chambers, located deeper underground than the original rooms, contained evidence of much more extensive criminal activity than had been previously suspected. The chambers appeared to have been used for longer periods and showed signs of more systematic organization, suggesting that Thomas Lunsford had been operating what amounted to an underground prison complex. Most significant was the discovery of detailed journals written by Thomas Lunsford himself, hidden in waterproof containers buried beneath the deepest chamber's floor. These journals, dating from 1876 to 1893, provided a complete record of Thomas's criminal activities and revealed the systematic nature of his planning. The journals documented not only his methods for selecting and capturing victims, but also his reasoning for viewing imprisonment and murder as acceptable forms of behavior. Thomas's journals revealed that his criminal activities had begun during his youth in Virginia, before he moved to Kentucky. He had apparently fled Virginia after becoming suspected in the disappearance of a local woman, and had deliberately chosen rural Kentucky because he believed the isolation would provide better opportunities for pursuing what he called his natural inclinations. The journals showed that he had always planned to establish hidden chambers for imprisoning women, and that the Lunsford property had been selected specifically because its geography allowed for concealed underground construction. The journals also documented Thomas's rationale for marriage, which he viewed not as a romantic partnership, but as a means of acquiring legal control over a woman who could serve his purposes when other victims were not available. His entries about Sarah Lunsford revealed that he had married her specifically because her lack of local family connections made her an ideal victim who could disappear without generating extensive investigation. Most chilling was Thomas's documentation of his plans for maintaining his activities indefinitely, including detailed descriptions of methods for disposing of evidence and for selecting victims who would not be missed by the community. Thomas viewed his criminal behavior not as a temporary aberration, but as a permanent lifestyle that he intended to continue for as long as physically possible. Dr. Torres's excavation also uncovered physical evidence that corroborated the journal's contents. The deeper chambers contained personal effects belonging to at least 12 women, based on clothing, jewelry, and other items that could be dated to the period of Thomas's documented activities. Chemical analysis of soil samples revealed evidence of human remains throughout the underground complex, suggesting that the Lunsford property had been the site of serial murder on a scale previously unimaginable. The discovery of Thomas's journals and the additional chambers prompted a final review of missing persons cases throughout eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. The review, completed in 1975, identified 23 women who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances during the period of Thomas Lunsford's documented activities. While direct evidence linking him to all of these disappearances was not available, the pattern strongly suggested that his criminal career had been far more extensive than initially believed. The comprehensive nature of Thomas's criminal activities and their influence on his son provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the mechanisms by which extreme family violence perpetuates itself across generations. Harold's journal entries, read in conjunction with his father's documentation, showed how exposure to systematic violence could create behavioral patterns that persisted into adulthood even without direct instruction or encouragement. The final disposition of the Lunsford case came in 1976, when all recovered evidence was transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for inclusion in their developing database of serial criminal behavior. The underground chambers were filled with concrete, and the entire property was designated as a federal preserve, with access permanently restricted to authorized researchers. The site was officially classified as a historical area significant for understanding criminal behavior patterns, but this designation was not made public. The Lunsford case files remained classified until 1998, when portions were released as part of an academic research project studying family violence patterns. However, many details of the case, particularly those relating to the systematic methods documented in Thomas's journals, remained sealed due to concerns about potential copycat behavior. Researchers studying the case must apply for special clearance and submit their work for review before publication. In the years since the case's resolution, the Lunsford story has continued to influence research into family violence and criminal behavior inheritance. The documentation of Thomas's systematic methods and the evidence of their effectiveness in shaping Harold's behavior has contributed to understanding how criminal behavior can be transmitted across generations, even when the original perpetrator does not directly train his successors. The case has also contributed to changes in law enforcement approaches to missing persons investigations, particularly those involving women from marginalized communities. The fact that multiple disappearances in the same geographic area were not initially connected to a single perpetrator has led to improved information sharing between jurisdictions and more systematic tracking of disappearance patterns. Perhaps most importantly, the Lunsford case has provided insight into how social isolation and cultural attitudes toward women can enable systematic criminal behavior. The fact that Thomas Lunsford was able to operate for nearly 20 years without detection was largely due to community acceptance of his reclusive behavior and limited investigation of disappearances involving women who were perceived as likely to have left the area voluntarily. Today, the former Lunsford property remains sealed and inaccessible to the general public. The land appears on county maps as the Lunsford Memorial Conservation Area, though few residents of current Harlan County are aware of the specific history that led to this designation. The concrete-filled chambers lie beneath 40 feet of earth and vegetation, marking the final resting place of one of Kentucky's most systematic criminal enterprises. The psychological impact of the Lunsford case extends beyond its direct participants to researchers and law enforcement officials who have studied the evidence. Dr. Sarah Chen, whose work brought national attention to the case, has written that exposure to Thomas Lunsford's journals was among the most disturbing experiences of her professional career. The systematic nature of his documentation and the casual tone in which he described extreme violence provided unprecedented insight into the psychology of serial criminals, but at considerable cost to those who studied the material. Similar reactions have been reported by law enforcement officials, archaeologists, and other researchers who have worked with evidence from the Lunsford case. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has established special protocols for handling the case materials, including mandatory psychological support for agents assigned to study the evidence. These protocols have since been adopted for other cases involving systematic family violence and have contributed to improved support systems for professionals working in this field. The Lunsford case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of inherited criminal behavior in American law enforcement history. The combination of physical evidence, contemporary documentation, and analysis has provided researchers with a complete picture of how extreme family violence can perpetuate itself across generations. However, the disturbing nature of this documentation has also highlighted the mental costs of studying systematic criminal behavior and the need for better support systems for those who work to understand and prevent such crimes. As we reach the end of this examination, it becomes clear that the Lunsford case represents more than simply a chronicle of individual criminal behavior. The systematic nature of Thomas Lunsford's activities and their influence on his son illustrate how family violence can become an inherited legacy that persists even when its original perpetrators are no longer alive to directly influence their successors. The hidden chambers beneath the Lunsford property, now sealed forever beneath tons of concrete and earth, serve as a physical monument to the victims whose lives were destroyed by this inherited violence. But perhaps more importantly, the documentation of how this violence perpetuated itself provides crucial insight into preventing similar patterns from developing in other families and communities. The storm that flooded the Lunsford basement in 1934 revealed more than just a hidden room. It exposed a legacy of systematic violence that had been passed from father to son, hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary rural family. The investigation that followed demonstrated how community isolation and cultural attitudes can enable systematic criminal behavior, while also showing how knowledge of such behavior can traumatize successive generations of those who encounter it. Today, more than 60 years after Harold Lunsford's discovery changed everything, the lessons learned from his family's dark legacy continue to inform our understanding of how violence perpetuates itself and how communities can work to prevent such inheritance from taking root. The silence that once protected the Lunsford family's crimes has been replaced by detailed documentation that serves to educate and warn, ensuring that the victims of Thomas and Harold Lunsford did not suffer and die in vain. The last official visitor to the Lunsford site was Dr. Margaret Sinclair, the psychiatrist who had first recommended sealing the property in 1952. In 1983, at the age of 86, Dr. Sinclair returned to the location to conduct a final assessment for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her report, filed shortly before her death in 1984, confirmed that the site remained stable and that the negative effects experienced by earlier visitors had not returned. Dr. Sinclair's final report included a reflection on the broader implications of the Lunsford case for understanding human behavior. She wrote that the systematic nature of Thomas Lunsford's criminal activities and their influence on his son represented one of the clearest examples of how extreme family violence could become an inherited trait. However, she also noted that Harold's struggle with his father's legacy, documented in his journal entries, showed that such inheritance was not inevitable, and that intervention might have prevented the cycle from continuing. The report's final paragraph, which has been quoted extensively in academic literature on family violence, offered both warning and hope. Neatest, the Lunsford case demonstrates that the human capacity for systematic evil can be transmitted across generations, through environmental influences and behavioral inheritance. However, it also shows that such transmission is not automatic, and that understanding these patterns provides the foundation for breaking cycles of violence before they claim additional victims. The silence that enabled the Lunsford crimes must be replaced by knowledge, investigation, and intervention if we are to prevent similar tragedies in the future. And so the story ends where it began, with water and revelation. The storm of 1934 brought flooding that exposed what had been hidden, beginning a process of investigation and understanding that continues to this day. The hidden chambers beneath the Lunsford property now lie forever sealed, but the knowledge gained from studying their contents continues to illuminate the dark corners of human behavior, and to provide hope that such darkness need not be inherited by future generations. The Lunsford case reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are often those that wear human faces and live among us, hidden by social isolation and protected by cultural blind spots. But it also reminds us that exposure to light, the light of investigation, documentation, and understanding, can break cycles of violence that might otherwise continue indefinitely. In the end, perhaps that is the most important legacy of the storm that flooded the Lunsford basement and revealed a room that was never meant to be seen.